The Durban July is one of South Africa's most glamorous annual events. This week, I dive into the story of legendary horse racing commentator Craig Peters, who will be calling his 38th Durban July in 2024. This is the story of one of the most recognizable voices in all of South Africa. Welcome to the Luke Alfred Show. I have 30 years of experience on the front lines of sports journalism, covering some of the biggest games in cricket, rugby, the FIFA World Cup, and even the Olympic Games. Come and join me as we learn about some of the greatest sports stories you've never heard. I'm Luke Alfred, and welcome to the show. South African horse racing commentator Craig Peters made his commentary debut as a 17-year-old way back in the mid-1970s. The venue was Gosforth Park in Germiston, a racetrack that no longer exists, and Peters was petrified of stuttering or making a mistake or calling one horse by the name of another. Practice up until then consisted of sitting by himself, watching a race, and commentating into a tape recorder. He would be dispatched into the stands at Vaal or Turffontein or even Newmarket, a track south of Johannesburg, and told to commentate on what he saw while recording every word, every hesitation, and every pause. Afterwards, those older, more experienced and wiser than he would listen to his recording. They would make suggestions leavened, if they were intelligent about such things, with praise. The apprenticeship lasted, according to Peters, who is Lebanese, for between 3 to 6 months. Finally, he was squeezed into the stalls and found himself under starters' orders, let loose on the track and told to have a run. By this stage of his life, Peters was no longer at school, having attended Mayfair High and Western High in Western Joburg before leaving early. As a boy, he sometimes used to accompany his dad, Stanley, to the races, sitting on the bonnet of his father's Valiant or Vauxhall, trying to identify the different horses. Horse racing and horse racing commentary was what made the youngster get up out of bed in the morning. The noble joy horse racing gives has hardly diminished for Peters in 50 years. Quote, "I was lucky," he says, looking back on his debut race. Big Swinger won the race I was commentating on at Gosforth Park by 8 lengths. It wasn't a difficult beginning. It was a soft landing, and I was away. I was also the first caller to ever commentate on a race from the racetrack in Bloemfontein. In a couple of days' time, Peters will commentate on his 38th Durban July, having become, if not the voice of horse racing in South Africa, certainly one of the most instantly recognizable horse racing voices in the land. He will make sure to go to bed early on the Friday night before the Saturday race because, he says, carousing and late nights are poor for one's eyesight and concentration. He, sometimes with his son Sheldon, sometimes without, will get to Greyville about 2 hours before racing starts. He will find his way to his commentary booth and feel his way into the busy day ahead, with him and Sheldon between them commentating all 12 races on the card, either for Supersport or over the Greyville public address system. Of the two mediums, commentating over the public address system is the more harrowing. This is because you are aware of the crowd, who exist behind things as a kind of visceral rolling surge. The crowd's voice rolls, it creates an echo, it roars as it rises before it falls. You have to be sensitive to the echo and modulate your voice accordingly, remembering at all times that you are required to be crisp, clear, and above all, accurate. Accuracy dictates that you know all the owner's colors. In the flying surge to the line, with the jockey's silks billowing, no commentator is able to tell horses apart, but he will be able to distinguish the owner's colors one from another. This can be tricky because some owners might have more than one horse in the race. If this is the case, jockeys' helmets become differentiating with, say, one wearing blue, another yellow, and a third red. All this must be learnt beforehand, but the peace and quiet of a commentator's booth is as fine a place as any in which to do some last-minute brushing up. Just like a jockey on a frisky 3 or 4-year-old, a confident start is paramount. Hesitation plunges you into the bowels of the damned. A key element of the commentary booth is the red light outside the back door, the equivalent of a do not disturb sign. Peters turns on the red light, or in his words, quote, sees that the button is working when he enters the booth. He might have a yak or pass the time of day. The media box at Greyville is close by during the afternoon itself, but mainly he wants to be left alone to compose himself and ease into the most important race of the annual horse racing calendar. He is not superstitious, he says, so doesn't need to wear his lucky shirt or pair of shoes for July Day. He used to introduce the jockeys in the parade ring beforehand, he says, and did that on 9 or 10 occasions, but the day became a little busy with those duties before the race itself. Now he waits calmly in the booth beforehand as he waits for the magic minutes in which the horses are eased and sometimes forced into the stalls. Peter's first July was the 1984 race. The previous year's race was commentated on by Trevor Denman, a legend in Peter's eye, and won by Tekla Bluff, and the young wannabe knew that he had a class act to follow. Quote, I was extremely nervous, he says of his July debut. I was shaking. The tips of my fingers were numb. It's the biggest race in Africa. You've got the crowd's reaction. You've got to modulate your voice. There are so many things to think about. Peter's first Durban July was won, and he'll never forget this, by Devon Air, trained by Terence Millard, famous for dubbing his horse, Empress Club, quote, the Galloping Goldmine. The young commentator was invited back the following year and has more or less become a Durban July and national institution bar for 2 years. 1 year he missed due to COVID-19, and before 1 July, he and his employers, I'm going to be genteel here so as not to hurt anyone's feelings, couldn't decide whether they were saddling up the same horse or racing in the same race, so decided to temporarily part company. The year before his official debut, 1983 in other words, was an intriguing one in terms of the race's development. Up until the 1984 race, the Durban July had a dead zone, or terra incognita section of the track from a commentator's point of view. This was because the drill hall blocked the commentator's view from the 1600-meter to the 1400-meter mark, so another commentator was sent to fill in commentary for the 200 meters during which the anchor commentator couldn't see the race. In 1983, that person was Peters, with the main commentary duties still being taken by Denman. Not only was Denman very good, he was very ambitious, and after the 1983 July, he made his way to the US, where he has enjoyed a long and illustrious career. His move created a place on the card for Peters, and he jumped, into the saddle the following year. Like all good jockeys, he hasn't looked back since. As luck, technological innovation, and circumstance would have it, 1984 also happened to be the first year that the Durban July, the fourth race on the card, was televised. This made life considerably easier for the new man. Rather than outsourcing commentary duties for 200 meters to a colleague, he simply watched the TV monitor in the commentary booth for the 200 meters that he couldn't see. With that section of the race completed, he returned to his binoculars to call the horses home. The horses' names in the 1984 race provide us with a glimpse of a bygone age. Some listeners might recognize one or two of them. There was Charles Fortune in the 1984 race, for example, and a Versailles, and a Count de Barry, and an Arctic Cove, a Spanish Pool, and a Spring Wonder. Forgive me while I interrupt the sports story to tell you about the Luke Alfred Show Patreon. As you may know, being a writer is not the most lucrative career choice. Please consider making a small donation to keep the show going at patreon.com/The Luke Alfred Show. But for now, let's get back to the story. Other than having a sharp mind, a good memory, and a clear voice, Peters says that the most important thing for a caller to remember is that you've got to tell the listener, or the viewer, where the horses are on the course and where they are in relation to each other. What does this mean exactly? It means constantly reminding the listener that, say, the leaders are passing the 1400 meters mark, or they are hitting the home stretch with, say, 500 or 600 meters to go. If you are commentating on the track's public address system, it is round about here that you begin to hear the crowd in the effects mic. They're getting up off their seats. Sometimes they're standing and, without really meaning to, walking closer to the track for a better view. They are shouting, sometimes whipping their legs absent-mindedly with a rolled-up version of the form guide. They are shouting some more, sometimes shouting themselves hoarse for their horse. If you are in the commentary booth at such a time, you can't but be thrilled at the surge of hope and excitement that you experience as you call them in, knowing that beneath you the punters are going berserk with expectation. Saturday's July is a race over 2,200 meters, so is neither a sprint nor a marathon. No length is ideal, but 2,200 meters is manageable because it allows the man behind the microphone to enjoy his work without feeling unduly pressured. It also allows him the license of flourish or whimsy or even occasional good-natured cheesiness. Who can forget, for example, when, in the 2018 race, Peters said about the horse African Night Sky, quote, "And African Night Sky is reaching for the stars." Forgive me while I interrupt a sports story to tell you about the Luke Alfred Show Patreon. As you may know, being a writer is not the most lucrative career choice. Please consider making a small donation to keep the show going at patreon.com/The Luke Alfred Show. But for now, let's get back to the story. Understandably, some Durban Julys stand out more than others for Peters. The 1984 race will always linger longer because it was his debut, but he also singles out the races of 2011, won by Igugu, 2013, won by Heavy Metal, and 2018, won by Do It Again, as Julys that he is proud of. For sheer edge-of-your-seat thrills, however, the race of 2008 stands out because it was so close, with Dancer's Daughter and Pocket Power making a last-gasp lunge for the line. Both were behind pace-setters Russian Sage and Strategic News for most of the race, and were still behind when the mare, River Jatez, thundered in front with about 300 meters to go. River Jatez couldn't hold on until the finish, and, with only meters to go and hysteria mounting, Dancer's Daughter and Pocket Power made their play down the middle of the track. We take up commentary with River Jatez on the outside, with Russian Sage still holding on gamely to the lead with the line in sight.
River Jatez is on the outside, and then she's on fire. Into the home stretch they come, the Vodacom Durban July. Russian Sage is still the leader. Down the inside, Buy and Sell, Bambana. River Jatez, Pocket Power, Pick Six on the outside. River Jatez comes into the lead. Here's Pocket Power running on. River Jatez, Dancer's Daughter's coming on powerfully. Pocket Power and Dancer's Daughter. Pocket Power, Dancer's Daughter. Pocket Power, Dancer's Daughter. Pocket Power.
You'll notice in this snippet that Peters intentionally doesn't call the winner. It is one of his articles of faith that he doesn't split the horse and pretend to know who the winner is in a too close-to-call race, and leaves that to the judges. Quote, "Why do you want to be the clever guy?" he asks rhetorically. It was just as well that he wasn't the clever guy in 2008, because history tells us that the race ended up being one of the July's few dead heats. River Jatez faded, and Russian Sage was well and truly left out on the tundra. Dancer's Daughter and Pocket Power dashed for the line as if their lives depended upon it. Despite the comparatively easy gig when he called Big Swinger to the win in his Gosforth Park debut as a youngster, Peters still had much to learn in the beginning. He went to elocution lessons. He was told to read as much as he could get his hands on. It was important to be attentive to detail in the manner of a writer or forensic scientist. He was told by the legendary Australian horse racing commentator, Bill Collins that it is a mistake to get stuck on a jockey whose colours you can't immediately identify. Simply move on to the rest of the field and come back to that jockey when the field has opened up. In recent years, as South Africa has changed and become more equitable, Peters has had to brush up on his isiZulu as horses with Zulu names and black jockeys come under starters' orders. If he's not sure about pronunciation, he asks, and he practices. Woe betide the commentator who snags on a difficult-to-pronounce name as the horses are rounding the false rail and heading for home. Peters has commentated on approximately 25,000 horse races, as he's also learnt a few tricks of the trade. In the 2008 race, for instance, which was the dead heat between Pocket Power and Dance's Daughter, he can be heard identifying a horse by his noseband. Anything to get his head in front. The 2008 race shows him at his accurate best. During the race, he tells us all we need to know about where the horses are and where they are in relation to each other, but he also manages to smuggle into his commentary some value-added extras. He estimates, for example, that the field from first to last is spread out over 16 meters. At another point in his passage of commentary, he tells us that the pace is on the slow side. It all adds up to a complete package in which the listener is told everything and more of what he needs to know. Races traditionally don't last for more than a few minutes, depending on distance, of course, but you still can't make any mistakes. This is what makes horse racing commentary so demanding, particularly if it's of the on-course variety. Peters has commentated on boxing, go-karting, show jumping, cycling, BMX and polo. Nothing, however, compares to the intensity of the Durban July in its demands. So good has Peters become at his craft that he even has a nickname to go with it. He has been called Eagle Eye for his ability to tell a potential winner from 300 or 400 meters out, an ability that has made him a firm favorite with the punters. The moniker distinguishes him from the much-loved Aussie caller, Ken Howard, whose nickname was Magic Eye. Not only did Magic Eye Howard have a cool nickname, he had a calling card which he used to dispense with a flourish each and every race, telling the punters that such and such a horse was, quote, London to a brick on. Here is a splendid example of Howard's commentary from a race in Australia in 1972, just so we have a feel of what he was all about.
It's Triton in front. Gunsend inch by inch getting at it. Big Butch zooming home down the outside. Gunsend's Doncaster. Gunsend got up and won. Triton second. Big Butch third. Fourth Ricochet. They're followed by Jane's Bow. At the head of the others we had Neptune's Kingdom Coalition. Then Refulgence followed by Halavariki, Regal Rhythm, Bow Rouge, Baguette, Zambari. Then Raja Saab, Silver Blue and Ponderosa last of all.
Commentating on the Durban July and commentating in general seemed to be a sort of wonder drug for Peters. Listening to a cross-section of his 37 Durban Julys, I'm struck by how ageless his voice is. Here is the voice of someone who is born to do what he does and who loves what he was born to do. We could be listening to someone half his age rather than a man who is 66 on his last birthday. Given his comparative agelessness, it is perhaps no surprise that he likens himself to the Welsh wonder boy singer Tom Jones. Big swinger that he is, Tom apparently still makes the ladies swoon well into his 80s. Quote, if the voice is there, the memory is there, and the eyesight is there, Peters says, then there's no need to even think about retiring. Maybe it's more than simply having the voice that never ages. The more, in this case, might be that Peters grows younger the more Julys he calls. Indeed, as the race ages, so Peters seems to grow younger in his telling of the race's story. Perhaps he shouldn't be nicknamed Eagle Eye, but Benjamin Button, the character from the film The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, in which Button is born old and becomes younger as the movie progresses towards its inevitably sad conclusion as Button dies the moment he is born. When asked if he has considered insuring his voice, given that it is such an important part of his professional identity, Peters replies that no, he hasn't. It is something he might have once considered. Now it is too late. Whether Peters has an ageless voice, or whether the event he gives his voice to makes him eternally youthful, this much is true. Despite the temporary glamour of an event here and there, the golden age of horse racing seems to be well and truly over. Once was the time when, in apartheid South Africa, you could only gamble on the GGs. Now, with the help of your smartphone, you can have a flutter on anything from underwater hockey in the Tasmanian First Division to darts in a smoky hall in Rochdale outside of Manchester. Quote, "They'll settle down for a run to the judge," used to be one of the Aussie caller Howard's more famous lines, and maybe it's true of horse racing in the wider sense. Maybe horse racing as we know it is settling down for its run to the judge, that judge being the march of time, the only judge and the judge of them all. Do we not all feel at some level of our being that horse racing is going only one way, the way of smoky pubs, cafes, coke in bottles, neighborhood greengrocers, landlines, newspapers, and petrol-guzzling cars? Do I confuse an event with an industry? Maybe the events will live on, thanks, in a small way, to the reassuring comforts of Peter's commentary in the case of the July, while the gambling part of horse racing will take up a smaller and smaller fraction of the online pie. Peters, the young man who cut his teeth on Big Swinger at Gosforth Park all those years ago, seems determined that this will not be so. He will continue to occupy the land of, "I know this guy's voice," even if you don't know who this guy is at all. As such, he has become that most precious and wonderful thing. He has become part of the oral fabric, part of the soundscape of our everyday lives. Such figures play small walk-on parts in the chorus line of our lives. They give voice to our everyday melodies. They are our cultural historians without ever claiming to be cultural historians in the slightest. They allow us to chart the seasons, the months, the years. They contribute to our memories, giving them shape, making them robust so that they will last. We take them for granted, and then suddenly they are gone and we are bereft. We think to ourselves guiltily that we should have taken better care of them when they were around. Peters and his voice are as much an institution as the institution that he has become famous for describing, over 2,200 meters. Not bad for a Lebanese kid from Mayfair who didn't finish school. Not bad at all. If you enjoyed this episode of The Luke Alfred Show, please give me a 5-star rating. As an independent creator, this podcast is made possible through your support.